Introducing a lot of like standard video feedback techniques onto 3D forms, we found that the variation form was far beyond what either of us as non-mathematicians could do by just hacking away at equations. So we developed a number of forms of feedback that aid us in creating these kind of new base models. And what's wonderful about feedback is that if you make a very small adjustment to any given parameter in whatever system you're working in, it can, in some cases, create incredibly dramatic results as opposed to very, very subtle results. And often it depends on whatever state was directly preceding your current state for it to actually get there. And so in many cases, there's no way to actually recreate a feedback scenario that you've created, which can be frustrating, but is also, as artists exploring a tool set that we've created, incredibly liberating, because we can create one of these patches and basically explore permutations on one very simple kind of feedback nearly for an infinite time. And we've played with a couple small ones we built for more than a year and not come near exhausting the possibilities of it. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes just, I don't really have too many like pre-built examples of it right here. This is a brand new piece of
basically
software.
live. It's just going to navigate.
But I'm just going to start with a base form. I think I'll probably go back to a plane before we start playing with the sphere and just play with it a little bit. This is kind of free form. If people have questions while we're doing this, it doesn't need to take all our attention. It can be something that can be happening while we're kind of talking about the other concepts. But just to come back a little bit to the idea of eugenics, I've created a number of possible ways for creating models. In some cases, it's actually it's writing an entire equation from scratch. In other cases, which tend to be much more effective, it's taking a large database of what we know to be good forms or eugenic forms that give interesting kinds of curvilinear spaces when you cross-read them. We've taken large databases of those and actually made it so that it can recombine in a variety of ways, whether it's completely randomized or with certain constraints that we provided. And when we start getting into that area, which to me is much more like a eugenic approach because you know the families that you're going to be reading from, that's where we've actually gotten our most useful material, which is actually really frustrating in a lot of ways because we'd much rather just start from scratch and have incredible forms emerge. But the fact is that what we've found, maybe it's the fact this is our experience, is that there are forms that tend to be much more pleasing and easy to spend a lot of time with than other kinds of forms. And when we start creating new forms from those forms as opposed to the incredibly complex ones, they actually tend to still be something you can get information out of. So if anybody has questions, feel free to start asking. We'll both start answering. This may take me a minute.
How do you determine what a eugenic form is and what is that reading?
Well, that's entirely subjective, I would say. But it's also, in some ways, that's actually not entirely true. There's certain processes that will take a form and try and run it through, and it will not cooperate with that process. It actually causes certain elements of the system to malfunction. And at that point, we decide, okay, we have to remove this from our database. Yeah, absolutely. There's times, we've actually had forms that will literally corrupt our entire software, and there's no way to get things working again except for to completely quit the whole thing and start it back up. And you don't even have to be doing any intense processing. It's just some element about the form itself. It's a piece of data contained within whatever the matrix that describes the form is. A piece of the data is actually bad and causes the system to malfunction.
I think that's what lots of Germany said.
Yeah.
They thought they were rebooting the system. Right. So, with your subjective portion, can you say a little more about that? This is your own subjectivity of what you find pleasing, or?
Yeah, sure.
You said curvilinear earlier.
It kind of depends a lot on what the mind frame is at the time that you're working with the software, because there's moments where you don't really want to be looking at something that's got a lot of jagged edges and spines. It's just not, it's not relaxing, it's not pleasant. And there's other times where that's actually exactly what I want to subject myself to, and looking at something that's mostly a sphere and very curvilinear or feminine in form, a lot of people will say, is not interesting to me at all. And so it's it's subjective beyond just my own personal aesthetics. It actually has to do with whatever my actual psychological frame of mind is at the time that I'm looking at a form, which is probably has a lot to do with the fact that there's nothing, we're not making decisions that are impactful. They don't need to be functional. It doesn't need to run faster. And so we don't have to worry about it being streamlined that way. But it's very subjective. I might look at something one day and think it's total garbage, and the next day find exactly what I'm looking for. And
we do get when we work with spheres, and we may pull them apart to the point where they're not recognizable as spheres, but the audience feedback on the curvilinear forms is always much greater than when we work with more cubist stuff.
Because we were all raised on streamlined design.
You know, this blank screen is incredibly beautiful. It's full of subtle depth, three-dimensional.
it can take on minutes sometimes to move this thing behaving.
So what kind of parametric forms are you working with? And that seems like that's going to be confined in this, the ability to build it, to construct them parametrically. Is that an easy, does that question make sense?
Can you try again, phrase it a little bit differently?
Well, just the mathematical forms that you're able to.
The models that we're using.
The models that you're using and the kinds of parameters that are therefore available for mutation would constrain this naturally. Do you have a taxonomy of the kinds of forms you mentioned?
Well, we've developed a lot of forms that are really complex that defy my ability to speak about them in
They're
a
probably
concise
algorithmic rather
way.
than mathematical.
But we,
No, they are mathematical
Yeah.
that we're working with now. We've tried to work with a couple that are more dynamic, where you can actually, basically what we're doing is, I'll just bring it over onto the screen for a minute and show you. This little block right here describes a plane, and so it's a two-dimensional matrix that's made up of 3 planes. One describes the x point, one's the y, and one is the z point in 3D space. And so we're basically taking an equation, writing it into a two-dimensional matrix, and then performing manipulations on a two-dimensional matrix to create morphologies. And so we've done other methods that actually allow us to work with the base equation that would generate the 2D matrix form and actually make the manipulations pre-2D matrix. But the computation power that's required leaves very little room to do any of the other stuff that we do in terms of transcoding and working with surface textures.
Well, for the technical stuff, we might want to revisit this in another talk with morphometrics and morphology. So I'll let you get back to the intuitive here. It's a great image right there. I assume you're not just dealing with the static form, but the evolving
Yeah, basically,
form.
with a feedback system like this, the way that it's functioning now, anytime you make a change, it's destructive in the sense that it permanently alters your new starting point for whatever next decision you make. And so if I scale back whatever parameter I just changed, instead of it becoming more normalized, becoming more like the original plane that it started out with, it takes this as its new starting point and becomes more increasingly chaotic.
so that is just a plane feeding back on itself.
It's a 2.5-dimensional structure, a surface.
Let's see if I can- Okay. So this is just a basic sphere, and then I'm going to be performing kind of a standard sine wave feedback operation on it here. And I don't have it in a continual